Good morning, dear holy brothers and sisters, friends. Welcome. It's Thursday, October 21st, the 15th of Cheshvan. We are halfway through the month of Cheshvan, and we're gathered today to study the Talmud. We are studying the entire Talmud with Hashem's help, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Masechet Shabbat, chapter 9, Amar Rabbi Akiva. We are on 82B, Pei Beis, Amud Beis. And again, welcome. Today we're dedicating our learning for good news for all of Klal Yisrael, but I want to mention a few people who recently reached out, hoping that we pray for some acute circumstances. So I want to mention Baruch Moshe ben Barbara for Refuah Shlema, young man who just had a heart attack. Hopefully have a Refuah Shlema, as well as Nisim Chaim ben Mazel, Chaim Baruch Eliezer ben Musa Esther, and Leah Basrita, as well as anyone else that is in need of a Refuah Shlema. And we'll mention the name Daniel Yerachmiel ben Gedalia, the Eloi Nishmasai. Let's have good news, abundance of good news for all of Klal Yisrael. To go straight into business, to get straight into the Gemara, we studied a Mishnah 2 days ago and began the analysis today about how to treat Avodah Zarah in regards, or how to treat Avodah Zarah, or rather, a rabbinic enactment, depending on who you ask. There are opinions that say it's biblical, to discourage any kind of interaction with Avodah Zarah. It became that it conveys, or it is that Avodah Zarah conveys ritual impurity. That's what the Mishnah says, quoting Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva quoted a verse from the book of Yeshaya, the book of Isaiah, indicating that Avodah Zarah should be set apart, distanced, just like a couple is distant during Nida. And that was the Mishnah. We discussed yesterday and the day before that, how does this come in Shabbos? And so I don't want to rehash that conversation today. Suffice it to say, we are going through a series of Mishnayot that have a series of different halachot that are extracted, inferred, or at least alluded to from verses in the Torah. Our Gemara yesterday and today, and probably tomorrow, are elaborating on some of the specifics, some of the details of in what way is Avodah Zarah like. In what way does Avodah Zarah convey ritual impurity? And surprise, surprise, there are varying opinions. And so we introduce a Mishnah which presents the opinion of the Mishnah, the Tanna Kama, as well as the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Namely, there are primarily two types of impurity that we're comparing Avodah Zarah to. The impurity, or the way impurity is conveyed by someone that is a Nida, impurity that is associated with a person who is menstruating. I think that's actually the most appropriate way in 2021 to say that. We're not going to infer gender, but suffice it to say a person that is menstruating has a certain degree, has a kind of impurity. This is not to say they are dirty, because ritual impurity has nothing to do with being dirty. This is not to say they are bad, because ritual impurity has nothing to do with being bad. All it has to do is that there are certain restrictions when a person is ritually impurity, and primarily that's associated with either being in the temple or interacting with certain foods that have degrees of sanctity. Although this is not the purpose of our discussion and it's not immediately relevant, I do want to share one of the theories of where and what is impurity in general. And so a beautiful explanation that I've seen, and I think it actually works well, is that impurity typically is in a space where there's the absence of life. So the most extreme degree, and I know I'm not going to do justice to the topic, but I just want to drop it here before we get into the Gemara. The most extreme type of impurity, of course, is the impurity associated with the corpse, a human body. Does that make a human body bad? Of course not. As a matter of fact, in Jewish tradition, we have great respect and great pressure to honor and provide dignity to the corpse of it worked out? It's good? Good news? Baruch Hashem. I'm sorry. So again, the fact that a corpse conveys ritual impurity is nothing to denigrate the human remains. On the contrary, we honor them, and in Jewish tradition, we continue to visit. But the ritual impurity is associated with the absence of the presence of life, of the neshama. And when a soul goes out, there is somehow the absence of life creates a kind of ritual impurity. The same thing I've seen explained in Holy Svarim about Nida. What is bleeding that's associated with menstruation? So it's typically associated with a monthly availability of an egg to be fertilized. When that egg is no longer viable and to be fertilized, so the body sheds the egg and the lining, etc., and that causes the blood of menstruation. So in a way, it's really an egg represents the potential for life. If it's not fertilized, it's the loss of that potential for life. And so I've seen explained that's why there's an impurity, because in a certain sense, it's like a mini, it's a missed opportunity for life. This is not to create a negative association. An egg doesn't need to be fertilized every time, because the egg, it represents the potential for life. Therefore, there's impurity. Just to be fair, there's also ritual impurity associated with the male component of reproduction. As we know, semen also conveys a certain type of ritual impurity. That's not because Judaism has anything negative about appropriate the reproductive process. On the contrary, it's considered something very holy. However, because the male and female component of reproduction is the potential for life, when it isn't part of creating life, it's viewed as a potential that was lost, and therefore there's ritual impurity with it. So I hope that provides some perspective or some sense of how that works. It doesn't do justice to the topic, but just enough to continue in our Gemara. So back to our Gemara. Other types of ritual impurities. Other types of ritual impurity are just factual. The Chachamim create a kind of ritual impurity about Avodah Zarah or primarily to encourage distance or to discourage closeness between Avodah Zarah. So I don't think we would apply the same principles that I just explained about purity in the biblical purity that's associated with the potential, the loss of life. Ritual impurity by Avodah Zarah, it's just to discourage association and to encourage distance. So that, I believe, is an introduction. Before we get into the specifics of our Gemara, Doctor, you're muted. I'd love to hear what you're saying.
I'm muted. I just as an aside, I'm just curious, in terms of egg donation and sperm donation, how does that reflect on ritual impurity?
Well, again, today ritual impurity is not a very important matter, except for the relationship between a husband and wife. So in addition, actually, let me back up. Doctor, I'm glad you asked that question, because yesterday we asked another question about a Kohen going to a cemetery if he's already impure.
Right.
So just like a Kohen, although he's already impure, cannot go to a cemetery because there's a restriction. So similarly, although a man and a woman in 2021 are both impure, there is yet a restriction of intimacy between a husband and wife during the Nida period. But I do not believe there is a major concern about the purity of the components that create an embryo as far as impurity. There are other concerns, however, which are real and present. And to be honest, it's not my expertise. Although maybe if I say that enough, you're going to be able to create a reel of me saying that every subject in Judaism is not my expertise. But,
they always say, ask your local
competent Orthodox rabbi. Suffice it to say, there are complexities related to the extraction of an egg and semen and in vitro, but not because it's necessarily a problem. On the contrary, there are many Jewish organizations that are very active in fertility treatment, including IVF. The area of concern is just to ascertain and verify that the egg and the sperm both belong to the person that they are purported to belong to, and God forbid a mix-up could have severe halachic implications. There's another question which I'm not going to provide the answer, which is the question of surrogacy. If a fertilized egg is implanted into the non-biological or non-egg providing individual, and so that's what a surrogate is, there is a complicated halachic question that I'm not going to answer here, which is, who is the halachic mother of the child? Do we look at the place the baby is born from, or do we look at the genetic material and the egg? And it's not entirely simple. Suffice, and we'll leave it at that. Reb Beryl.
Just practical what's going on today in that field, Bernie. In Montreal, our chief rabbi, Rabbi Weiss, is an expert in that. And I am told that he is always there when they do the techniques, whatever techniques they do, in his presence.
So actually, exactly. So there's actually, and again, I know we're going off topic, but you know what? This is important. Then it's interesting.
We're
And
never off topic here.
It's related. Remember, we had recently a Gemara that taught about that. A student should really ask on topic. But over here, we're covering the whole Torah, the whole Talmud. So every topic that could possibly come up is on target. There's actually, and I know this might sound strange, there are mashgichim. When it comes to taking an egg and with embryos and everything regarded to IVF in halachic tradition today, there are mashgichim, people that are hired to keep a physical eye, making sure that nothing happens. Now you'll say the Jews are going on Bissel Meshuga, but Google mix-ups with egg donation, and it's not that it happens all the time, but it's not unheard of and it's not impossible. And then there are other kinds of mix-ups as well, or other kinds of mishaps or kind of events that people hope would never get out. And then with the ability to do genetic or testing where people are finding out things about their heritage and about their family story that is not what they imagined or what they understood. And then one last thing, where did I see this? That there is a possibility. I think people that receive, is it blood? No. We discussed this once. Stem cell donations could plausibly mix up the genetic markers of the blood. So a person could potentially, certain donations, I don't remember the specifics, could potentially cause a DNA test to present the DNA of the donor and not the recipient.
Bone marrow transplant.
So it could be a life-saving thing, but it could plausibly.
The person's female, the donor was male, and when they do the whatever the DNA markup, they come up male, even though they're female.
Because they're getting essentially the DNA of the donor.
They got the blood marrow from a male donor. Yeah.
Suffice it to say, if you want to see interesting and thought-provoking conversations, subscribe to some of the rabbinic journals that discuss contemporary halachic questions. And because science is so fantastic, and because science is developing so much, it presents big questions. There's a new question. I heard a half a podcast today. They have the ability to edit, how do you call it? To do DNA editing.
The chromosome strands or whatever.
Yeah, and so it's great because let's say someone has the genes for
Whatever.
For how do you call it? There's a blood malady.
Tay-Sachs.
Well, no, Tay-Sachs, but no. What? No. There's a prevalent blood disease in African Americans. It's not sticky cell.
Bleeding now.
Anyways,
Yeah, it's sickle cell anemia.
Sickle cell. So there are actually today studies where they've actually been able to modify, they've identified and are able to modify those genes. And what they do is they take out the part of the blood, they edit a significant number of the genes in those blood cells, and they introduce it, and they've cured such diseases. But there's a big ethical question of, is editing a gene appropriate, and how far? And what about today? And I know we're going off. What about today where you might have multiple fertilized embryos and you can identify the gender? So can you select the gender of your next child, et cetera, et cetera? And so suffice it to say, the rabbis who are experts on these topics, Rabbi Weiss from Montreal, I think Beryl mentioned, and there are other rabbanim that actually, they're very, very busy, and there's a lot of complexity in the matters. So today, I want to bring your attention back to a much more simple and straightforward matter, which is our Gemara, the discussion of the ritual impurity imparted by Avodah Zarah. And back to my intro, the question is, do we compare the conveyance and the ritual impurity? Is it conveyed in the style of a nida or in the style of a sheretz? That was the question. Rabbi Kiva says it's like a nida. The Chachamim say it's like a sheretz. And it's really there's a lot in common between the two, but there are specific halachic characteristics that are unique to nida, and there are certain halachic characteristics that are unique to sheretz. And the question that our Gemara is now going to embark upon in a good number of lines is, which characteristics are applied to Avodah Zarah and not? And that's going to be our question. And we're going to actually have two opinions, Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim, and we're going to have two ways of interpreting the machloket. So basically, two opinions. Each one can be understood in two ways. So we're going to have four different ways of understanding the halachas of the ritual impurity conveyed by Avodah Zarah, and we're going to introduce a few new ideas, which Be'ezer Hashem will provide a basic introduction before we come upon it. So, anyways, okay. Now we'll share the Gemara. We'll share the screen. In 82B, here is the Mishnah we read yesterday from Masechet Avodah Zarah about how if a wall collapses, you take it in. You seed some of your structure so as not to contribute any benefit to Avodah Zarah. And then how do you treat the materials? Well, it conveys ritual impurity. Rabbi Akiva says kinida, and well, the first opinion says kesheretz, and the second opinion says kinida, manida, and then the Mishnah says. So I guess we'll come right in the middle. Manida metama b'masa. Nida impurity is conveyed if you carry it even without direct contact. And similarly, Avodah Zarah could convey impurity even if you didn't touch it. And the example we gave, although maybe it's imperfect, the statue that lands on your basket and you didn't touch it, but you might be ritually impure. Again, you didn't worship Avodah Zarah, so you're not culpable for the big issues, but there's still ritual impurity. Amar Rabba explains, what does it mean? Tizarem kimaydava. When the Gemara says tizarem, it means nachrinu mina chizar. Set it apart for you like a stranger, just like a husband and wife, in a certain sense, behave like strangers to one another when they're in nida. If they're abstaining from intimacy, and especially if they're observing all the harchakot, which is further separation that might transpire during nida. So similarly, a person should set themselves apart from Avodah Zarah. Say to him, he kanes al tamarloi. Be distant, don't be close. And that is, Rabbi explains how we should treat Avodah Zarah always. Now is where the long conversation comes. V'yamar Rabba said in regards to our discussion, B'masa, when it comes to carrying impurity being conveyed through carrying, even if you didn't come into physical contact, Kuli alma loy pligi dimitama. Everybody agrees that ritual impurity. Who's everybody? Everybody here is Rabbi Akiva and the Chacham. Everyone really agrees that the Avodah Zarah conveys ritual impurity by carrying. The hayitakash lenida, because ultimately Avodah Zarah is compared to kinida. Ki pligi, what is really the essence of the argument? So Rabbah says, I need you to be a little creative. Read the Mishnah. If you read the Mishnah superficially, it sounds like the argument is masa carrying or not. Rabbah says you got to dig deep. In truth, ki pligi, what is the crux? What is the essence of their disagreement? Be'even misama. It's about an even misama. What is an even misama? Rashi, even shesamuha al gaba yitedot. It is a stone that is placed on top of planks, beams. V'kelim tachteha, and there are vessels underneath it. Kidichsiv, as it says in the book of Daniel. So everyone, this is, if I would ask you to share with me the top 5 most well-known stories of the Bible, not only among Jewish people, but among people of all faiths, one of those stories might be the story of Daniel in the lion's den. What was the story in short? Daniel, the king, made a decree triggered by his advisors to outlaw prayer to anyone, to not appeal to anyone other than the king. Daniel, who was an important advisor, but also an important Jew, would not stop to pray to God. He was busted, as you might say, and his punishment is to be thrown into the lions. By the king's order, Daniel was brought and thrown into the lions. Then the king spoke to Daniel, saying, your God, whom you serve so regularly, will deliver you. The king is hoping. The king says, my hands are tied, but I really hope you make it out of here. Now, how do you keep if you put a person into a lion's den, the first thing they're probably going to do is try to get out. And so it wasn't enough that they threw him in. V'hei sasis even chada v'sumat alpum guba. A rock was bought and placed over the mouth of the den. A rock is on top of the mouth of the den. So now Daniel is unable to escape. All right. Even me sama Rashi. This is a stone that's on top of beams, and there's stuff underneath it. Kidichsiv, and the proof he brings is from Daniel. So you have a rock that's being supported by beams, and there's stuff underneath the rock. Vinida aizav yoshim aleha, and a person that has the ritual impurity of nida or zav. I know it sounds like a little bit of an obscure, or a lot of an obscure scenario. You have a nida or a zav sitting on top of the rock. Although the rock is ultimately not adding weight upon the vessels underneath it, because the rock is supported, and so no matter what weight you put there, you can't sense that there's anything on top of the rock. Hakelim Tmeim, the vessels are still, Tmeim, Hakelim Detsiv, Kol Asher Yetachtav. So a vessel under a rock, which has an impurity on top of it, although the rock is so unbudging, this is Rashi's interpretation, it yet conveys ritual impurity. Should we read Rabbi Steinsaltz? Okay, we'll read Rabbi Steinsaltz. I'm not sure if he agrees, if he embraces Rashi's interpretation of it. There's a special law with regards to ritual impurity of a zav or menstruating woman. If they sit on an object, even if an object that cannot become ritually impure, beneath the object is a vessel, even though the weight of the zav has no effect, it becomes ritually impure. Okay, so Rabbi Steinsaltz does a nice job explaining it. So again, you didn't touch the vessel. The thing you touched doesn't usually convey ritual impurity. Yet, because you were sitting on top of it, it conveys ritual impurity. That's the Evan Misama, the law of this stone, that it can convey ritual impurity. Although usually rocks don't convey ritual impurity, especially if you made no effect to it. Tosfos has a different interpretation, but I think we're going to keep it simple. We're going to avoid the interpretation of Tosfos. So
why does Rashi have to go all the way to Daniel when he has the story of Yaakov removing the stone from the top of the bear?
What is the language used over there?
Vayagal at
so Rashi is looking for evidence that the word misama could be, and so visamt, although the words are actually different because it's a different language, but the shorash, because there's the interchange of, I believe, Rashi, based on the interchangeability of Aramaic and Hebrew, Rashi is saying that the word Evan Misama is connected to this word. And so therefore we have proof that it means a stone that is placed. Otherwise, we don't have much biblical record of the use of this word. Now, before we continue, you're asking a good enough question. I want to look over here, although I don't usually turn here. Give me 1 second. Why does he bring proof from the book of Daniel? Yeah, he wants to bring proof from the book of Daniel for the use of this word. See anything else to add over here?
Rabbi, is there any significance that they say the woman to sit on the rock? And if she stood, is it different? I don't want to get too gruesome.
I don't believe so. We're talking about the human. It's not only a woman. Zav, nida or zav, a male or a female impurity. We're actually not discriminating here, but they convey impurity by sitting or resting their weight on something, even if. So here, what's unique is that the weight is not actually being on top of the vessel directly, but yet it is conveyed. Apparently, there are a number of other alternate, nuanced interpretations of the identity of this stone, but I think we should keep it simple because I think that's what we should do. Yeah. Yeah, Tosfos beats up Rashi, but we'll stick with Rashi for now. So again, Amar Rabba. The truth of the matter is everybody agrees. Everyone agrees that if you carry it, even if you don't come into direct contact, impurity is conveyed because ultimately it is compared to Kipligi. Their argument is in a specific scenario of this stone that's supported, and therefore it doesn't move even with additional weight, and it doesn't create any imprint or effect on the item underneath. How so? What is the argument? Rabbi Akiva Savar Kinida. Rabbi Akiva says, like the Mishnah says, Kinida, Manida Metama Be'evan Misama, just like Kinida and Azav. Actually, the conveys ritual impurity through the stone. Similarly, Avodah Zarah conveys this type of ritual impurity. Rabbanan Sabri Kesheretz, the Chachamim say no. The decision, the halacha, that Avodah Zarah conveys ritual impurity is primarily like a sheretz, and therefore, if you have a statue on top of a stone that's on top of stuff that's being supported as Rashi portrayed, the ritual impurity is not conveyed. Again, how often, how common does this occur? I don't imagine that often. But yet, in this one area, Rabbanan say no. Kisheretz. So you can avoid Avodah Zarah. I'm sorry, you can avoid ritual impurity in this situation. That is how Rabbi understands the machlokes. The Gemara is not done with that. Now the Gemara is going to start probing how Rabbi learns the Gemara and why he says what he says. And so, as I told you, we're back to Talmud. Well, the Rabbi Akiva, let's understand Rabbi Akiva. In what area is Avodah Zarah appropriately compared to a sheretz? Because Rabbi is telling us that in truth, Avodah Zarah is compared both to Nida and to sheretz. And only in regards to one specific halacha is Avodah Zarah uniquely like Nida, and that's for this Evan Misam. So let's back to Rabbi Kiva. So now let's ask Rabbi Kiva. Let's try to understand his opinion. In regards to what matter is it appropriate to compare a Avodah Zarah to a sheretz? Lim sham sheha, to the items that are supportive of idol worship, or in the words of Rabbi Steinsaltz, the accessories. Rashi she'ein hakelim hamishamshin mitamim lebemasa v'loy be'evan misama. It's compared to a sheretz lisham sheha. If I understand Rashi correctly, it's compared to a sheretz to prevent the accessories from coming ritually impure from the Evan Misama, and in other ways that Nida is conveyed by carrying. So Avodah Zarah, it can be compared to Nida with the Avodah Zarah itself, but there's a more lenient law when it comes to Misham Shah. And now let's go to the Rabbanan. In which area do we compare Avodah Zarah Linida Lemasa, to convey ritual impurity when carried, but not an Evan Misama? So the Gemara says, if that's the case, if both Rabbi Kiva and the Rabban Chachamim are picking and choosing features that are like sheretz and features that are like Nida, well then why doesn't the Torah, why don't the Chachamim find a different analogy that works more precisely? And that would be based on your assertion, why don't we just compare Avodah Zarah to a nevela, to an animal that conveys ritual impurity because it wasn't slaughtered properly? Rashi, let's read Rashi. The isbei masa, because its impurity can be conveyed if you're carrying its weight, even without direct contact. And conversely, it doesn't have the law of the Evan Misama. It doesn't convey impurities through the stone. So basically, we are saying that, Avodah Zarah, in one aspect, it's like this, and one aspect, it's like that. Well, we would have had a perfect analogy, a perfect case of impurity that we could compare to Avodah Zarah. So the Gemara answers, Inochanam, you're right. If we would have chosen to compare Avodah Zarah just to a nevela, we might have had a more precise analogy. but there's a problem. There's an aspect of nida that we need to convey to avodah zarah that's not thus portrayed. So let's read it. And again, if you're losing some of the details, I think the goal is just to get the general flow of the conversation. Ella, man, why do we need to compare? Hold on one second. Why do we need to compare avodah zarah to nida? If we would have had a better, if nevela would have been a better comparison, manida eina levarim, avodah zarah eina levarim. This is a hypothetical. Don't be grossed out. Hypothetically, were a limb of a nida or a zav to be detached, a person would have an amputation. While in the state of ritual impurity, that limb would not continue to convey the ritual impurity of a nida or a zav. Yes. Where's your barrel? I know this is out there. Rashi. Had a limb from a person that's a nida or a zav been amputated, it would convey ritual impurity as a limb of a body, but it would not convey ritual impurity as a nida. Why is this relevant? Because if an avodah zarah is made of pieces, Rashi, if you would hack off a limb from a statue of avodah zarah, that limb would not convey ritual impurity, although it used to be attached to an avodah zarah. And so this is another obscure, out there comparison, but it's necessary more for the laws of avodah zarah probably than nida, and so therefore we want to have the comparison.
Rabbi, I have two questions here.
Go ahead, please.
If a limb was torn off of a man, then the limb is dead.
This is true.
So it's impure.
This is true.
Okay. Now, if a man has a bleeding nose or bleeding hemorrhoids, does that render him impure?
No, blood, generally speaking, does not render a person impure.
So why is a menstruating woman?
There is a unique biblical, because there is a unique biblical command that when the Torah communicates all the different types of ritual impurity based on the God's divine infinite wisdom, that sometimes we understand and many times we don't fully understand, that that causes ritual impurity. I mean, I gave you a theory that's brought in Jewish tradition, which is that the blood of a nida is associated with the failure of an egg to fertilize, or the absence of an egg being fertilized. And so that potential for life, the absence of that potential for life.
Can a kohen touch a limb that's removed?
I don't believe so. I believe
Then it's impure.
The limb of a body conveys impurity like that of a corpse to some extent. Our point simply is a person that is a zav or a nida who loses their limb. There are bigger problems, right? Obviously, God forbid a person. I mean, I could just imagine us imagining that God forbid a person has an amputation and they don't care that they lost the limb. They're just worried about the ritual impurity it conveys. Obviously, that's silly. But here we're looking at the abstract hypothetical of it, and we're acknowledging that that the nida impurity is not conveyed by an amputated limb. And it's really not that relevant for a nida, but it is relevant for its application to the laws of avodah zarah. So again, I know it's like an out there comparison, but it's more valuable in its application than the original matter.
This is like trying to understand the rules of the red heifer.
Something like that. The laws of ritual impurity generally are both the most. I'll tell you this: in the laws of ritual impurity, the halachot maybe you can get down pat, but it's hard to make precise sense and to have a precise appreciation for them. They are indeed described as the ultimate chok, the ultimate statute, where it's in the Torah. We adhere to it because Hashem said so, but we struggle to comprehend the rationality behind all of them. So that is a fair statement. Doctor?
Let me ask you a question, please.
Bevakasha.
An ever,
Yes.
a leg if it's amputated, I think it needs to be buried. Am I correct?
Correct. That is generally the practice. yes.
So what happens during surgery if any organs are removed? Do they have to be buried?
So Jews endeavor to have limbs that are removed in surgery to have them
Is that
treated
because
according
of
to Jewish law.
Chiyat HaMitim?
It has to do with Jewish treatment of limbs and human remains or body parts. It's not always possible, understandably. When it is possible, Jews. So, for example, my mother had a lung transplant, and I believe they made it. And getting lungs also meant disregarding her old lungs, her sick lungs. And so those lungs, if I'm not mistaken, there was at least an attempt to see about burying them. I don't recall if it was possible or not. I believe it was, but suffice it to say, one tries to do so. It's not always possible.
So
There's
how
something
far
that
does
the-
it go? For instance, an extracted tooth.
I do not believe a tooth that we apply that to teeth. Doctor, you're off the hook. You don't have to become buddy with a Chaver Kedisha. Let's.
You-
Oh, yes,
You-
Rivero.
You'd have to save the gold in the tooth, which was the bigger concern. The findings,
laugh.
the
Don't
findings,
laugh.
I know. The guys came
Don't
around,
laugh.
pick up the findings.
We collect them and yeah.
Rabbi,
Yes, doctor.
I'm back. I'm sorry I missed a few minutes.
Welcome back. We missed you, but we're happy you're back.
Yeah. What about animals? Parts of animals.
It's a different.
Burying. Yeah. An avela, a totally dead animal, a part of an animal that's been severed.
I don't believe that is the case. No, I mean, admittedly, man's best friend. Many times, people that lose a dear pet, they would want to honorably treat the remains, and that's okay, but that's not a halachic necessity.
Right.
So, like, let's say as a rabbi, one of the things that we occasionally are called upon is to educate people about Jewish burial and honorable treatment of human remains, and to try to encourage, let's say, sometimes a person doesn't leave instructions in their will, and so the kids aren't always on the same page as their parents. And so that's, by the way, a good reason why even a very firm person should make sure that they have all of their final arrangements in a legal document, in a will or whatever, so that even if, God forbid, many years from now, the kids don't see eye to eye or they're not available or whatever, that way your halachic desire will be honored. But many times we're called to intervene or communicate in that regards. But when it comes to pets,
Pets are very difficult issues to deal with children. About young children, when a dog or a cat dies that they've lived with all their lives. It's
Yeah, I mean, I think parents-
Yeah,
oh, of course, and parents should do their best to help their kids through that experience, and perhaps burying is an important way
right.
for them to
right,
process the
right,
grief.
right.
And
Yeah.
Doctor, I'm sure in your expertise you've encountered a
Yeah,
distraught.
I've been to
client that-
burials for pets,
Listen.
very meaningful for kids.
Yeah,
Listen,
there are a few backyards in Teaneck that you can find them in.
That's right, but my kids didn't want their cat buried in the backyard. They wanted better than that. I
Right.
won't
So
tell
listen,
you the whole story. Yeah.
archaeologists in 1,000 years from now are going to have a whole study. You're going to have a whole paper about how the Jewish community of Teaneck had a tradition of burying a dog in their yard, and we're going to want to know if it had some kind of religious significance. Anyways, all right. All right, so back into the Gemara. So the reason why the Nida is brought into this equation and the Zav is brought into this equation is for the story of Eivarim. That Avodah Zarah does not convey ritual impurity if it's only a piece of Avodah Zarah. And I want to just bring your attention immediately to the Rambam to show you how this is codified in Jewish law. Kotzatz Eiver Mimena, you hacked off a limb of an Avodah Zarah. And surely that was not perceived as a respectful act towards Avodah Zarah. The limb, no matter the size, it's pure. The ritual impurity conveyed by Avodah Zarah is only when the form, the statue, is whole. And the source is our Gemara in the verse, and he uses this very comparison. The ritual impurity of Nida is not conveyed to a limb if it's amputated. And so there you have it. Okay. This is the Ram, just so you see that this is codified in halacha as well. Now you'll notice it's in the Rambam's work, but it's not in the code of Jewish law, and it's for the very reason that I explained. The Rambam is called Hilchasa L'Mashicha. Rambam writes the laws, even though the Rambam lived in the time of Galus and the diaspora, and many of the laws of the Beis Hamikdash of ritual impurity were not relevant. The Rambam is inclusive of all halachot, even those that are not presently applicable in Avodah Zarah. So the Rambam writes about the ritual impurity of a limb of Avodah Zarah. The Shulchan Aruch is talking in the current day. Well, there's not really much practical application or relevance to the ritual impurity of a limb of Avodah Zarah. Reb Beryl.
Rabbi, again, these things are not out of the context of what's going on today. In Montreal, we have the huge shrine, and it's all built around the heart of the original priest. It's not, just these things, these crazy people back then.
Yeah. In other words, I think this is probably a Catholic.
So worshiping his heart, according to what I'm looking here, Nishka Perla.
No. Hold on. We have to distinguish. Whatever. I don't want to get into it. I believe Catholicism is very into hearts and stuff. But all right, let's hold off on any further elaboration. But indeed, yeah.
Tastes good.
So there we have it. An initial understanding of the Gemara, the way Rabbah understands it. In truth, everybody agrees that we can infer certain halachic facts from Nida and from Zav, but there are certain areas that we are uniquely akin to Nida, certain areas that we're uniquely akin to Zava. And so now we have, if I'm understanding this correctly, we have a situation where Avodah Zarah conveys ritual impurity, less so to the accessories. It is conveyed, however, with carrying, and it doesn't convey ritual impurity with Eivarim. So the Gemara now continues. Now we have a problem. We have a famous, I don't know if he's famous. We have Rav Chama Bar Gorya who asked a question. He asked, Avodah Zarah, Yeshna Leivarim, Ina Leivarim. Is Avodah Zarah conveyed if it's from a limb and it's detached or not? Tivshoit Lamiha. Why didn't we just infer from this comparison to Nida? And the Gemara answers, from here we can infer, because the Chachamim say that you compare Avodah Zarah to Nida, we should be able to infer from here that there is no Eivarim. Not only Rabbi Kiva. So Chama Bar Gorya, Rabbi Kiva Baila. So the Gemara answers, no, you're right. Rabbi Chama Bar Gorya always knew that the Chachamim would agree that there's no ritual impurity conveyed by Eivarim, because Rav Chama Bar Gorya knew this Gemara, and he knew that the Chachamim compare Avodah Zarah to Nida. His question that was left unanswered was Alibad Rabbi Kiva. According to Rabbi Kiva, who says, hold on, why? Let me see. According to the Chachamim, of course, ritual impurity is not conveyed through Eivarim, just like Nida. But Rabbi Kiva, we have a question. When Rabbi Kiva says that we compare Avodah Zarah to Nida, does he say that we compare it to every detail or only the Chumrah? If you're lost, I don't blame you. It's a little complicated. Just one last question. Rav Chama Bar Gorya asked the question, according to Rabbi Kiva, does Avodah Zarah convey ritual impurity? And the reason why he cannot turn to our Mishnah and say, of course, it is not conveyed by Eivarim. We compare Avodah Zarah to Nida. The reason why we can't apply that, says Rashi, is because it's possible that Rabbi Akiva is essentially shopping for chumras. He's applying all of the stringencies, but not leniencies. The lack of the conveyance of impurity through the limbs of an Avodah Zarah is essentially a kula. And Rabbi Kiva possibly is of the opinion that we want to make avodah zarah as haram, as verboten, as forbidden, as off limits as possible. And so maybe Rabbi Kiva would not ease up on the question of limbs, and therefore Rav Chama Bar Guria is left with a question, even though we know that the Chachamim compare avodah zarah to nida for the purpose of Eivar. So there we have a little bit of a dialogue, a little bit of a thought process, and exactly how Rabbi Kiva understands and how the Chachamim understand the ritual impurity conveyed by avodah zarah. But now we have to go back to the start, go back to the Mishnah, because we're going to have another question, or we're going to revisit this very same topic again. With your permission, I'm going to run through this fast, and maybe we won't get every detail, but I want to get on to the next Gemara, and hopefully you'll pick up the flavor. Rabbi Lazar learns this machlokes of Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan in a different manner. Hold on. I just hit mute all, but again, please unmute. Just there was some strange sound in the background. Rabbi Lazar understands the Mishnah, the machlokes, about how to apply the laws of ritual impurity to avodah zarah based on a comparison either to sheretz or to nida. He understands it differently. Rabbi Lazar says everybody agrees that the ritual impurity conveyed through this stone with the weight of the stuff underneath, as we explained, that ritual impurity is not conveyed from avodah zarah to other items. Regardless of if you compare avodah zarah to sheretz or nida, Evan Misama is out. It does not convey ritual impurity. Rashi, because we learn it from sheretz to know that it cannot be conveyed through that kind of weight. The question here is only if you're carrying it. When you're carrying it indirectly, remember the example that we said of the basket where the statue landed in your basket. Rabbi Kiva Savar Kinida. Rabbi Kiva says, of course, ritual impurity of avodah zarah is conveyed when you carry it indirectly, because we compare avodah zarah kinida, manida metama b'masa, avodah zarah metama b'masa. Nida, you could carry a person that is in nida status, or other ways that the nida impurity could be conveyed. Even if you're not touching them, you will still convey the ritual impurity. But Rabbanan, the rabbis say no. Savri kesheretz. They compare the statue of avodah zarah to a sheretz. Masheretz lemetama b'masa, avodah zarah metama b'masa. They say that it cannot be conveyed by carrying, only by direct contact. So this is essentially a more lenient understanding of this machlokes. So Gemara now asks, okay, now ultimately Rabbi Kiva also knows that the verse compares avodah zarah to a sheretz, but you're telling me that he compares it to nida for the purposes of carrying. So what halacha does he infer from sheretz? To teach us that we are more lenient about the way that impurity is conveyed to the accessories. Which halachic fact, which detail do the chachamim apply from nida to avodah zarah? You know what? It's a leniency. Manida in a levarim, avodah zarah in a levarim, to teach us that if a limb of a nida, God forbid, or an zav is amputated, that limb no longer conveys ritual impurity of nida. It does convey ritual impurity of an organ of a body, which is perhaps a bigger problem. But for our purposes, avodah zarah in a levarim, you hack off a limb of a statue, that limb no longer conveys ritual impurity. So the Gemara says, okay, Rabbi Kiva, so let's think. Why does Rabbi Akiva choose to compare avodah zarah to nida lemasa, to teach us the law of carrying, that you could convey ritual impurity even if you don't touch it directly? So the Gemara asked the question that we saw in the previous iteration, Lakshla nevela, then just bring in a nevela and say that you'll compare avodah zarah to a nevela. How is it compared to a nevela? Well, because a nevela ritual impurity is conveyed by carrying. The Gemara answers, in hachanami, you are correct. However, there's an additional detail, a halacha about nida, that also needs to be applied. Manida in a levarim, avodah zarah nevarim. Rabbi Kiva also needs to know the halacha that ritual impurity is not conveyed by the limb of a avodah zarah. The Gemara now continues, very familiar, very similar to our previous Gemara. We know that Rav Chama Bar Guria had a question. What was his question? He wanted to know if avodah zarah conveys ritual impurity if you just come in contact with a hacked off limb. We know that according to Rabbi Elazar's understanding, Rabbi Kiva, everybody agrees that avodah zarah is not conveyed by the limb of an avodah zarah, just like anida, deina levarim. And so he should have left without a question. He should have had his answer. My answer is, you know what? You're right. Rav Chama Bar Guria kirava masni uvaylei Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Chama's question was because he doesn't accept Rabbi Elazar's interpretation of the story. He learns like Rabbah. And according to the way Rabbah understands the story, according to the way Rabbah understands the machlokes between Rabbi Kiva and the Chachamim, we don't know if Rabbi Kiva embraces would embrace the leniency applied by Nida. We think he only wants to apply Chumras. Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so now just to do a fast recap, I told you we're going to go back to our Gemara style. You have machlokes, Rabbi Kiva, and the Chachamim. The Mishnah just says, do you compare Avodah Zarah to Nida to Sheretz? But it's not so simple, because ultimately Rabbi Kiva and Chacham know, or both admit, that there are areas where we compare Avodah Zarah to Nida, and there are areas that we compare it to a Sheretz. The question is how strict or how lenient in our interpretation. Rabbah understands that Rabbi Kiva is extremely machmir, and in the second iteration, the way Rabbi Lazar understands the machlokes, it's a little more lenient. Here, everyone agrees Evan Misama does not convey ritual impurity. The main issue that Rabbi Kiva wanted to communicate about was that it's conveyed even if you carry it, which leaves us with the answer to the question of Avarim. Ultimately, the Rambam, as we saw, paskins according to the more lenient take, or perhaps he's following the Chachamim, that ritual impurity is not conveyed by a limb. By the way, we've just turned the page to 83. So we turned from 82.
Rabbi,
Yes, Rabbi.
Before you race off, you slugged up my question, does she have to sit? And here, they seem to be dealing with that.
Again.
If she touched it, it's not enough because it's just her limb. Does it say specifically sit in the Hebrew or it doesn't?
It's called the impurity conveyed by sitting. But it means the impurity conveyed by your weight being on top of it. So there's two issues. Carrying, which is you bearing the weight upon you, or you placing your weight on top of. But let's if you don't mind, let's leave that off for now. With Hashem's help, there are other mesechtas that will go deeply into detail about the nuanced specifics of the different ways of Avodah Zarah is conveyed, impurity is conveyed. This Gemara is an important step in that conversation, but I want to keep our attention focused on Avodah Zarah. I'm just debating if we should continue. Let me just see how. Okay. So now we have two interpretations of the machlokes of Rabbi Kiva and Chachamim, one that's more lenient, one that's more machmir. Let's see a challenge according to, let's see. Avodah Zarah, there's a brisa that says, Avodah Zarah, kisheretz, mishamsheha, kisheretz. The Chachamim say that we compare Avodah Zarah and its accessories to a sheretz. What is the law of sheretz that we're talking about? Impurity is only conveyed by immediate, direct contact. Rabbi Kiva Omer, Avodah Zarah kenida u'mishamsha kisheretz. Rabbi Kiva says no. Avodah Zarah itself is like a nida, where it can be conveyed even without direct contact. U'mishamsheha kisheretz. However, we apply a greater leniency to its accessories. This is almost identical to Rabbi Elazar's assertion above. So the Gemara says, Bishleima, the Rabbi Elazar nicha. This sounds identical to what Rabbi Elazar said above. That again, it's compared to a nida as far as its immediate contact, and it's compared to a sheretz as far as the accessories. The Rabbah kasha, but Rabbah does not understand Rabbi Kiva to be saying that. Rabbah's going to respond. Are you going to find yourself bothered by a brisa? I'm going to bring a Mishnah that supports me. I know that there's a Mishnah that says, I'm sorry, I believe what he's saying is I actually have a bigger problem. There's a Mishnah, but I'll give you the answer to the Mishnah and I'll answer the brisa too. We'll look in our Steindels in a moment to make sure that's the shot. The Mishnah says, if you destroy a wall, it's wood, it's stone, it's earth, all convey impurity of a sheretz. And this is, I believe we're going to call this mishamshin, right? The wall of a structure is not avodah zarah, it's only the accessory, and yet it conveys ritual impurity like a sheretz, which seems to be a rejection of Rabbah's understanding of the machlekes. So he says, listen to my interpretation, my sheretz. What do we mean here, sheretz? The lametama be'evan misama. When I compare Mishnah, when Rabbi Akiva says in the Mishnah that we compare Avodah Zarah to Asheretz, we only mean in a very narrow, in one specific halacha. It's one very obscure, rare kula, that there's no such thing as the law of the Evan Misama, which again is that funky stone arrangement. So we had a Brisa and a Mishnah, which seemingly challenge Rabba's way of interpreting the machlokes between Rabbi Kiva and the Chachamim. And we have Rabba's defense. We have Rabba's support. When we say kisharetz, we don't mean it in entirety. All right, I'm going to stop over here, my dear friends. Tomorrow we'll be already through this discussion. We have one more case study, one more challenge that we'll get, and then we'll move on to the next topic. I want to thank our dear friends, all of you, for being here, for providing great perspective, wisdom, and contribution to the Talmud Chabura. You never know what you're going to get when you study Gemara. Every day could be another kind of discussion. So here we have today's style. Again, briefly, the Mishnah, where Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim disagree, and two different ways to interpret their disagreement. And all of that is different ways to understand the ritual impurity conveyed by Avodah Zarah.
Quick question, Rabbi, if I may. Can a sheretz be an insect?
Yes, there are certain creatures. Some of them are insects. Some of them are other critters, rodents, that convey ritual impurity. Yes.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I sent you a note yesterday. There's an excellent article in Jerusalem Post of life in Israel at the time of the temple.
Yes. I didn't read it, but I
Where
saw
the
the headline.
You got it, Rabbi. I sent it.
Shkoyach Rebel, can you do me a favor? Because I don't think you sent me the link.
No, I couldn't send the link. I just told you to look at it. I'll try. I don't know how.
I saw the headline referenced. I follow a Jewish archaeology blog.
Very interesting. They mounted a whole exhibit in a museum. I think it's in the Galil, with all the things when the Sanhedrin moved and whatever.
There is some amazing stuff out there, indeed. And there's actually a park somewhere that's like an archaeological park somewhere in the Galil as well. Maybe it's referred to where you can walk, and the people have found different stuff, and they also say it's connected to the Talmudic era. Gentlemen, Yasher Koyach, thank you so much. Have a blessed day. And I hope we'll see everyone tomorrow. Gesundheit and Freilich.